Welcome to Dialed In on the Virtual Care Journey with Jeremy and Becca, your trusted companions in navigating the ever-evolving landscape of virtual care.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on Dialed In on the Virtual Care Journey. I'm Becca Bean, and today we have Amy Rosso. She's here with us from Raptor Technologies. She is the Director, Expert in Residence, I think specifically on mental health.
Absolutely.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about who Raptor Technologies is and what you guys do?
So Raptor Technologies is a school safety software company. We got our start many years ago with visitor management. So if you've been to an elementary school and you put your ID in, spits out a badge, make sure you're supposed to be there, that's how we got started. But now we have a whole host of products that really are able to help keep kids safe on a continuum. So I mainly work with our products, Student Safe, which is really about early warning signs, early indicators if a student is struggling with their well-being, and then can do things like suicide screening or behavior threat assessment.
Yeah. Which is kind of how we got to know you, Amy,
Absolutely.
is because our program, Dialogue for Schools, really connects then that next step of care with students with licensed professional counselors for therapy session. How did you get to Raptor? I know you have a very interesting background that I'd love for people to hear.
Absolutely. I always joke that I don't think anybody, when they're in fourth grade, say, hey, I'm going to be in school safety. It just doesn't happen. I was a girl who loved business. I wanted to be an accountant. So that's what I went to college for at Baylor University. And it was my sophomore year, my mom died by suicide. So it actually changed the whole trajectory of my life. And I became very interested in mental health and suicide prevention. So got my master's and my doctorate in counseling, was a mental health counselor for a number of years, but always felt this pull for mental health education, realizing that counseling is great, but if we also don't have people talking about mental health and breaking down stigma, how can we ever help anyone to actually get the care they need?
Right. And I will say in school, it's also one of the places where it's hardest to overcome that stigma. You don't want to be the person that's the outlier from your friends.
Absolutely.
Getting help. So today we're really going to be focused talking about how there's kind of that alignment between school safety and mental health. We're both companies that are based in Texas, so it's kind of a hot topic in our state for how schools are working to improve school safety. And we're both companies that are also raising our hands going, mental health is a big part of that. So Raptor does the badges. How do they integrate mental health into their pieces?
Absolutely. It goes back to the Student Safe product. And that's why I ended up at Raptor. I was at a school district leading a team of social workers, director of behavioral health services. I oversaw our threat assessment processes, suicide screenings, all of that. And I kept seeing that we were worried about school safety over here, and we kept putting mental health over here and realizing they can't be separate, that students struggling in any way need support. And so Raptor had this product called Student Safe that I was asked to be part of focus groups as they were launching it. And it really is how individuals in a kid's school day, all of them notice different things, right? If you think about like a school bus driver, they see a student at the first thing in the morning, the last thing in the afternoon. They notice if a kid's changing. Our cafeteria workers, of course, our teachers. And so Student Safe gives that ability for staff to be able to put in and say, hey, I noticed Bobby doesn't hang out with his friends anymore, which that one piece of information might not be that big a deal, but if it's combined, so then a school counselor can say, hey, a lot of people are noticing a change. Do we help intervene before it gets to a crisis? And that crisis could be a student not wanting to live themselves or to be violent towards others.
Well, and that student, Bobby, it is that exact what you're talking about. So the school bus driver can notice he's not talking on the bus anymore. Then the teacher notices something different. And I love that that's kind of a holistic whole child approach to looking at it too, allowing everyone an ability to connect and communicate.
Absolutely. And when we think of school safety, after any targeted violence, especially within schools, those pieces of the puzzle get put together, but it's always after the fact.
Yeah.
And it's no fault of anyone. There was just not a system. And so I really saw that Raptor's the one company that says we can do something before. Like, what if we start putting these pieces together before and be able to provide intervention services before it's a crisis? And so being able to help all students.
Okay. And how many schools does Raptor work with today? Do you know?
We're all across the United States, and we actually have in the UK also, so we're international.
Love it. Cheerio. That's my awful British accent.
Absolutely. So we're in every state with a variety of different products, really making a difference and really wanting to be leaders of how do we not just react in safety situations, but how do we really prevent them ever from happening in the first place?
So I know with this, how do you guys bring in the role of a parent to your technology and your solutions? Obviously, you've addressed how a lot of the school employees have the ability to tie in, but parents are obviously just as concerned about their kids' mental health as anyone else.
Absolutely,
yeah,
and
if not more, their kids.
We have a new segment called Public School Works that does a lot of our educator training, compliance training, even like the regulations for health, all of those things. But they also have what we call an anonymous tip line, or you can do that online on a computer. It doesn't have to be just calling. So being that ability that anybody in a kid's life also has opportunity to say if they're worried or if they hear something. You know, I heard a speaker the other day, in our world of social media, don't repost, report.
Oh,
so if you're worried about something, if you have a concern, reposting, then you're just sort of putting the spiral going on. But if you report it in a variety of different ways, then you're able to get the help needed.
And that's great that the tools for reporting are just becoming more simplistic and easier for people to have access to. Jumping in, where did you find when you were on school some of the challenges that you had that you think we're working towards solving?
I think the biggest is access to good quality care.
Yeah.
I think seeing so many students in different circumstances, families in different circumstances, and so how do they connect with the care that's needed that's a higher level than what the school can do. School counselors are amazing. They do hard work every day, yet that role is limited, and it's not intensive therapy or doing that more deeper mental health work. That has to be somebody from the outside. You know, we have school counselors and school psychologists, and they all have their role. At the same time, being able to connect students with quality mental health care that's above what a school is to provide, I think was the biggest thing I saw.
And I think this is a interesting point and something I've heard at other conferences with other speakers. School counselors actually are very limited in terms of what they're allowed to do from a licensure and liability perspective also. I don't know if parents and even students understand, like, they're there to do guidance, direction.
Yes.
A lot of their work has become administrative in terms of setting up career plannings or college plannings versus focusing on that overall well-being of the student. And the advice that I've heard given is very much like, if it comes to anything clinical, you should be referring out, and it can hurt them personally with their profession if they don't do that.
Absolutely.
And it's hard to see a student in need and not jump in.
100%, you know, and also the caseloads of our school counselors, you know, they have so many students they're responsible for.
Yeah.
And so even if some way they could, it just doesn't allow. So there's so many roadblocks of why our school counselors aren't the one to provide that higher level support that many students need.
Right. I know at one point there was talk within our state about, could we put a mental health professional in every school? And we were part of the group that raised their hands. There's not enough licensed mental health professionals in our state to accommodate a request like that.
Well, and what you're bringing up too is there is a shortage of mental health, licensed mental health professionals. And, you know, it's always been that way, but especially after COVID, we saw such an increase in need, and so many of our therapists got burned out.
Yeah.
It's hard work. And so how are we able to connect students with care, even with all these roadblocks in the way?
What do you think some of the biggest roadblocks are now for families and students to get care?
Some of it is just time, right? Like I was a therapist for a while. I saw, you know, I would see people from 8 to 5.
And that's a lot of people sharing their problems and their struggles with you.
It is, but at the same time, when can most people take their kid to a counselor?
Right.
It's not 8 to 3, like they're in school, families are at work. And so that's a roadblock, is how do you connect when individuals have time? And, you know, many therapists do nighttime sessions and things like that, but those are still limited.
And I would say, for what we've seen with some of our metrics, is our students, the most popular time to use our program is Sunday afternoons, which just aligns exactly with what you said. Oh, that's when they're in homework zone or family time, and it's easier for them to step away, and our therapists actually like being able to see someone in their home environment with technology.
Absolutely.
It shows a lot.
Absolutely. Because that's a different thing too. Seeing them in school is one thing, but they might behave differently, or what is home like?
So we've talked a little bit about how students need personalized approaches to mental health. If you were to be talking to any school administrator trying to set up a school safety and mental health program, what advice would you give them?
How do you leverage all your resources?
Yeah.
I think COVID presented so many challenges. I think it showed us new ways to do things. And I know at that time I was the director of behavioral health. I actually got hired 2 months before COVID happened.
Great timing.
Great timing, the first ever director of behavioral health and creating this department. But it was also, how do we take what we have and think in new ways? And I saw quickly where parents previously maybe were against teletherapy as an option, being able to say, that's the only option my kid had, absolutely, I'll do it.
Right.
And I think that really, while teletherapy was around before COVID, I think it really got people to open their minds. I think there was a mindset of how can you form a connection with someone over a screen? And I think it showed us we can. It is possible. And there's some people that that's even a better fit for.
Well, and I think that's even a front line, how kids are interacting with even their friends, right? They're not necessarily doing what I used to do, being excited I got that, second landline upstairs and calling. They're like, no, they're FaceTiming, they're using social media, which there's pros and cons to that also, but they're not necessarily connecting in the same ways with their peers, so it makes sense to pivot that for their mental health as well.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes we sort of harshly judge teens of like, well, they don't want to do this and like they're not comfortable. And I'm like, to send someone to a therapist, a counselor, that can be scary.
Yeah.
Right. Like, I mean, I've been to therapy and I remembered going when I was doing my doctoral work. It's what I was studying and it was still a scary process. And so I think some teens even prefer if it can be a teletherapy because it makes them more comfortable and it's what they're familiar with. And so if you're struggling, like how to get a teen actually wanting to go, it can be a bridge. It can be very helpful because then they are doing it in a format that they're really comfortable with.
Perfect. How do you find that schools can help support families when they are at the place where they decide they need to move forward with therapy?
I think schools have such a unique opportunity to be able to connect families to resources. Many people were raised not talking about mental health. There's so much shame and stigma. I always talk about that, like the way in the time I was raised, that it's just you didn't talk about it. If you needed help, you were weak or crazy. And so I think that some of our families, the adults, that's still the stigma they were raised with. And not right or wrong, it just was their reality. And so being able to be that sort of warm handoff from the school to someone else and being able to say, you can trust this, and even giving parents education on what mental health is, that if your kid's struggling, it doesn't mean you're a bad parent at all. And really being able to be that connection and sort of lower the stigma and sort of be able to give quality information of what it is like to be able to get help.
We had our mental health clinical director on for our last episode, and she gave some poignant advice. She goes, she personally believes every person would benefit from some level of therapy.
Absolutely.
Whether it's you go in once every year to do like your sanity check or your levels, or you're someone who needs weekly reoccurring appointments. Like it's just something to help get your words out to someone who's a third party and neutral and not heated. I hate to say my kids are little, so 5 and 6, so our battles are more around can I have this dessert? No, you can't have your third ice cream. But as they get older, it's trying to determine the right way to still be a parent and set boundaries, but recognize they have strong emotions, lots of hormones that trying to struggle through some of those things are always.
And realizing kids are growing up in a totally different world than we grew up. Right? Yeah. I can't relate completely with my son. Yes, I've been an 11-year-old. But I wasn't raised with all the technology around me, with our world where it is. I didn't live through a pandemic when I was 5. And so I think really being able to take that and understand it. Also to sort of say, I think oftentimes when we talk about mental health, it's either everybody's great or you're in crisis. And realizing our mental health is on this continuum. And how do we start helping identify when students start going to coping or struggling and not waiting for it to be a crisis point.
I was about to say, and that kind of points out the very next item on our agenda to talk through is, what are some of those strategies in identifying those students? I know we've talked about some of the reporting tools, but what other tricks?
I think the biggest thing is people to trust themselves. School staff, parents, you know when your kid's acting different. You know when their behavior is different. You know when their emotions are different. And you definitely know if they're talking different. And I think too often we sort of try to downplay it and say, oh, it's not that big a deal. And so,
or it's just a phase.
Or that's just a teenager. I think we don't do that with physical health at all. No. If our kid is struggling with their physical health, we know we get them to the doctor or even call the nurse on call. And so we have to get better about seeing that our mental health is just like our physical health. And for parents or teachers or any educators, it's not your job to fix it.
Yeah.
Right? It's being able to get them to the next level of care that can be supportive and can help.
I completely agree. And I'm definitely, unless they need to go back to school quickly, you're like, oh, that fever, it's right under. But mental health, I think it's important to take some of those mental health days and really kind of let students recover from all aspects of their health when they need to.
Well, and realize we all struggle.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes as parents and educators, we want kids to always be happy. And that's not reality. Reality is life has ups, life have downs, sideways, everything in between. So how do we help kids and students, teens understand how to cope with those? And for many, coping is, I do need to go see a therapist. Right. Or some, it's developing some different skills that can help me through those rough times. And so I think it's really understanding what's going on and how do we support a student through them struggling, not just trying to make them happy in the moment.
Right. And a lot of it, I think, is around adult modeling, right? Is if you realize you're stressed, being able to show your kid, here's how I count to 10 and do deep breathing and talking it through, which is, I think, also a different parenting tack where not everyone realizes I should verbalize what I'm doing so my child or your teacher to a student sees this is how I cope with it versus just kind of coping with it and then presenting that everything's okay.
100%, because how often do kids think parents are perfect? I mean, they really don't, but they're like...
I was about to say, I can already tell you.
But they
that's
think,
a big no.
But oftentimes, if you're not being vulnerable and being willing to say you struggle too, they think you don't ever struggle. So when they struggle, they think something's wrong with them. And so normalizing that we all have to learn to cope. We all struggle at times so that students feel like they can be able to say, I'm struggling right now, instead of I have to hide if I'm struggling.
Yeah. One of the things we were going to talk about is even just the term mental health. I think if there are tools that we can give students to know that that's not a negative thing and it doesn't have a negative connotation.
Absolutely. I also think right now we see this gap. We have like my generation and right around me that we didn't grow up talking about this. Our younger generations are okay talking about mental health. I've helped, when I would go into classes and talk to high school students, I would say, what's the one thing you want us adults to know? And they say that it's real, that we do struggle. And it's not just that we're hurting at times, and they want their parents to understand. So I think there's sometimes this generational gap, and we as the adults have to be better about understanding and then talking about it.
So the phrase my mother gave me of put your big girl panties on and deal with it and let's just go is not necessarily what this generation is looking for or asking for.
And there's a balance, right? Because there is a balance of I can be in that moment, but at some point we are going to have to move forward. But how do I recognize the emotions and feelings and saying I'm hurt right now? And how do we use strategies and coping skills to be able to continue to move in the direction we need to?
Perfect. One of the things I wanted to ask you about was identifying some of those red flags and talk about suicide prevention, because obviously the sooner we can identify a student or an adult that needs intervention so it doesn't get to that point is obviously everyone's goal. However, there are always going to be, unfortunately, incidents that someone is at that critical moment. How would you say a staff member or teacher would recognize that? And then what are some of the tools that they have at their disposal?
Absolutely. And so I think the biggest things are, we always talk about talk, mood, and behavior. So the three, it's just more on an escalated. If a student's talking about being completely hopeless, no reason to live, if they say, I just don't want to be here, I want to die, that we take those seriously. I often hear people say, well, aren't they just doing that for attention? No. A, I'm not going to make that judgment call without checking in. And B, if somebody's doing that for attention, they need help.
That's a lot of attention they're asking for.
Yeah. And even joking, and then behavior. Has their behavior changed? Are they acting recklessly? And the one thing with mood, I think a lot of times when we think about suicide or those things, we think of depression and we think of someone crying.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really important we sort of like go against that stereotype, because some people might cry, but if I've been raised my whole life never to cry, if I'm struggling, maybe I only think I can be angry. So I am angry or irritable. And so I think it's really important we look of what those changes are and not just write it off as somebody's acting bad, but maybe it's their only way of expressing they are completely struggling.
It's their coping mechanism, which is everyone's coping mechanism is different.
Absolutely. And if you recognize those, I mean, if you're an educator, that's when you take the student to the school counselor or whatever your protocol is, but don't leave the student alone. If you're not at school, that's when you ask directly if they're thinking of suicide. And it's a big myth if you ask that it plants the idea. That's actually the furthest from the truth. We know by research.
I love that. So from the expert. Ask. It's better to ask.
We know asking saves lives. And so I think those are the really important things for us to know.
Yeah. One of the other things I want to call out is we're such a huge fan of the suicide prevention number becoming more simplistic to 988, and something we just want to remind everyone listening that if you know someone's struggling, either you can call to get tips, or you can ask them to call, or you can call with them. So 988 is out there and it's important.
And you can text it too. So I think for our teens, that can be really good. I
did not know that. See, I learned something new.
In some states, it has to be on the back of their name, their ID badges. So in Texas, where my son is in school, for middle school and high school, it has to be on the back of the ID badge, which is also a life-saving measure.
Yeah, the more marketing that can go out around it, the better.
Absolutely.
How do you think there's a difference between student mental health in urban versus rural areas, and then school safety also?
You know, I think sometimes we don't think about our rural communities. As someone who grew up in a town with 1,200 people, I think about rural all the time, and I know kids struggle there just as much as they do in urban settings. But what I also know is access to care is a lot more limited in our rural communities. They're just not there. Or if your nearest counselor to go to a session would be an hour away. So
you're not in weekly therapy then if you're having to drive an hour each way.
You're not at all. And so I think those are some of the big roadblocks that can happen for our rural communities. And not to say there's not roadblocks in urban, but I just think we have to be more intentional thinking about those who grew up in small towns and what does their care look like and how do they access quality care.
Okay. Well, Amy, are there any other things you'd like to make sure that people hear about mental health, about Raptor today?
I think a few things. I think first, just when we talk about suicide prevention, a resource that I've been a volunteer for 10 years with American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. They have amazing free resources. So if you're wondering like, what do I do? And it's afsp.org. Chapters in all 50 states. All their programming is free. For Raptor, I think being able to look that we aren't just a company that sells software. We're a company that truly is invested in making this world safer for our students. And so Raptor is a great place to go. I do a podcast once a month on student well-being and host lots of different things that is information. It's not about selling a product. It's about helping our schools be able to keep kids safe.
Which I think is everyone's overall goal here.
100%.
Keep them safe, keep their mental health where it needs to be, and redirect kids when it needs to happen. So.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Amy, today for joining us. We're really excited you were able to be here with us on Dialed In on the Virtual Care Journey. We're really excited about this conversation. I think we had so much important information that was shared about mental health, school safety, great information around suicide prevention. Please feel free to listen to our podcast on YouTube or wherever else you get your podcasts, Spotify, Apple. We're excited to have you join us today, and we look forward to having you join us next time.